Why Squirrels is brought to you by The Root Down, an ADHD-inspired presentation and process to know, respect, and connect yourself. Available now for conferences and savvy companies, The Root Down will bring your team together, teach them about neurodiversity, and a lot more. Check out The Root Down, read the reviews over at whysquirrels.com today. Welcome to Why Squirrels, the podcast for late diagnosed adults with ADHD. I'm your host, Dave Delaney. So recently I started seeing a psychologist, partly because I wanted to make sure that the meds I've been on are actually working. That's actually a big part of it. And she quickly realized that what I was on was way too low and probably not the right stuff. And so things have been adjusted. And we had an hour consultation, which went quite well. I was feeling really good about it. And this was last month. So this month I showed up for my second appointment with her. We're doing monthly appointments. Sat down and we started talking. And 30 minutes into the conversation, she kind of abruptly ended things. And I was perplexed. I'm like, what's happening? And she said, my follow-up appointments are 30 minutes. It took me an hour to drive to a 30-minute appointment, which I thought would be an hour. And truly, I feel like needs to be longer than an hour, really. But I understand. But 30 minutes. And that was not a good start for where my head's been at recently with work and with life in general. And my new friend Eric, who is an ADHD coach and expert in this stuff, and I were talking, and he mentioned RSD, rejection sensitive dysphoria. And so if you have ADHD, this could be why you may be feeling rejected or feeling failure or really hitting walls with self-doubt. And the more that I read and learn about RSD, and I've written a little bit at Why Squirrels about it, but the more that I learn about it, the more I realize, hold on, this is totally me. And that's not fun. It's not good. I have to admit it's not good. And so I was reading on WebMD. I don't fall down these rabbit holes. I'm not a hypochondriac or anything like that. But I'm navigating this like you are, probably. Maybe you're listening to this because you are a spouse or someone who is connected to somebody else who is a late diagnosed adult with ADHD. Maybe you're a Why Squirrel ally. Anyway, I was reading some of the WebMD symptoms of RSD. Be strong people pleasers. That is me. I am very much a people pleaser. Feel more embarrassed or self-conscious. I'm definitely self-conscious. I'm not so embarrassed. Have low self-esteem and self-doubt. That is definitely a struggle. Display sudden outbursts of physical emotions like anger, tears, and sadness. That's me as well. Anger, not as much. Engage in negative self-talk. I don't even want to go there. Have difficulty managing their reactions. Sometimes that is me. Find it draining to manage relationships. That's an interesting one. And probably a topic for a whole other podcast episode. Sorry about all the scratching noises in the background. Peggy is finding a bed. So she is, scratching up the carpet. And then suddenly becomes quiet, moody, or shows signs of depression or anxious feelings. And again, that's me. And especially lately. And part of the problem here is that my business has been really quiet this year. I've been working for myself now for 12 years, and this is the first year where things have been uncomfortably quiet. The first quarter of the year was great. Went into the year kicking ass and things were looking really good. But after the first quarter, things got quiet, and they have continued to be quiet, and God knows I'm trying. But when you talk about and read about RSD, I don't know if professional stress, running your business, can trigger RSD. Obviously, I'm not a doctor here, as you know. I'm sharing this journey with you, but I wanted to share kind of where I'm at right now. And I know things will get better, but sometimes you just don't know how long you're going to be in the clouds for. And right now it feels like I've been in these dark clouds for way too long. What a shitty way to start an episode. Gosh, I'm sorry about all this Debbie Downer stuff. Let's turn it around a little bit, because this episode is going to be really inspiring. And actually, it made me feel a lot better as I listened to it again as I was editing. My guest today is somebody who he still has ADHD. We don't not have ADHD, do we? He was diagnosed with ADHD at 60. And, that's interesting. But even more interesting is who he is and the accomplishments this gentleman has had in his 60 years on this planet. And I say on this planet because Dr. Bob Dempsey is not your ordinary aerospace professional. With a distinguished career at NASA as the International Space Station Flight Director for 16 years. And his current role is a director of flight operations at Blue Origin. If you don't know what Blue Origin is, you definitely got to check that out. Mr. Bezos is behind that one. So he's no stranger to commanding complex missions and pushing the boundaries of space exploration. But what truly sets him apart is his really remarkable journey of self-discovery and personal growth. And this episode is going to be really inspiring. And again, it had me thinking a lot as I was talking to him. And as always, before we get started, I want to give you a quick reminder that the content provided in this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice or diagnosis or treatment. I'm not a medical professional, so always seek the advice of a qualified healthcare provider regarding any medical condition, including ADHD. So reliance on any information provided by this podcast is solely at your own risk, and instead, go see your doctor. Talk to your doctor. I began the podcast today by talking to Dr. Bob and verifying exactly what I should be calling him. Is it Robert Dempsey, Dr. Robert Dempsey, Dr. Bob? So here we go.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We have ignition.
Do you prefer Dr. Bob?
It's kind of funny. Most people know me by that because I was actually trying to hide my PhD when I came down to NASA, and a friend like day 2 said, "Oh, you're Dr. Bob," and then it stuck. So almost everyone knows me by that now.
Okay. Why were you trying to hide your PhD? I would imagine a PhD in physics and astronomy would be applauded.
Well, I was transitioning from the astronomy world, more academic, to NASA, which was more engineering. And my colleagues in astronomy were saying, "Hey, those engineers don't like eggheads, so don't let them know you're a PhD." So that's why I was trying to keep it a little on the lowdown.
That's interesting. So tell me a little bit about your background and, how you transitioned from astronomy to physics, but also the background here too. I'm
perhaps rare in the sense that I when I was like 6, which happened to be when we landed on the moon, I said I was going to be an astronaut. And while I'm sure a lot of boys back then said that, I never wavered. I always wanted to explore space. I envisioned at the time I was going to be a fighter pilot and, the right stuff and all that stuff. But I then learned I had to have glasses, which ruled that out. And I loved astronomy. So I said, fine, I'll go be an astronomer and, fly in space as a scientist. I then discovered that, astrophysics, which is really what I studied, is really hard. And, there's certain things now when I would tell this story in hindsight, with what I know now about ADHD, that I look back at some things and it's like, oh, yeah, well, a lot of that makes sense. And, we can come back to that in a little bit if you want. But then, so I went into astronomy as an undergraduate and then went on to get my master's and PhD and went off and started having kind of by accident a fairly good research career going when I decided that wasn't really the way I wanted to explore space like I had envisioned. I'd always kind of thought that if I wasn't flying in space, I'd be like in NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory control room where they were, having probes at Jupiter or Mars or something like that. But I wasn't really happy there at the Hubble Space Telescope Science Institute doing research, but I was really enjoying the part of my job where I was operating the systems that help the telescope function. And I decided, okay, I got on a plane, flew down to Houston and applied. And at that time, the International Space Station program was just really getting going. And since I had done a bunch of programming, both as for my PhD and then at the Hubble Space Telescope, they said, well, we can put you in charge of the computers on the space station. I did that for about 5 years and then changed groups to the communications group. And then in 2005, I was selected as a flight director. If you've ever seen the movie Apollo 13, if you remember the Ed Harris character in the white vest going around saying failure's not an option, that's the flight director in charge of everyone in that room, which was a job that I did then for the next 17 years.
Wow.
When I left that role, I was actually the second most senior flight director in NASA's history. And at the time, it was an awesome job. I absolutely loved it. It couldn't have been any more than what I ever dreamed or wanted. But it's funny, trying to now get a little bit to the ADHD, talking to my psychologist and my coach. I didn't realize that what I always thought was my superpower in the control room was actually my ADHD. And what I mean by that is it's an extremely challenging job, as you can imagine. What's happening, an analogy I often use is it's a little bit like the Chinese circus performer that's balancing like 20 plates on sticks. You have a lot of people bringing you a lot of snippets of little information, and you have to kind of dart back and forth between them. It's a challenge to keep it all straight, but in a way it's kind of a forced disfocus where your brain jumps around. And, a lot of people struggle with that kind of thing. And, I have over the years too, but in that environment, it seemed to really like match perfectly or resonate, if that makes any sense at all.
So at 60, you're diagnosed with ADHD, and I'm curious, what led to that diagnosis, if you don't mind sharing. And just so you understand, or not so you understand, so I was diagnosed this year at 50. I'm now 51. And I'm curious kind of what led to that. And also reflecting on your own career, connecting the dots, because, well, let me first ask you about what led to your diagnosis. Let's start there.
No, that's a completely fair question. Throughout my life, especially when I was in college and graduate school and then a postdoc and stuff like that, the thought crossed my mind that something wasn't right. And, sometimes it was like, oh boy, these guys are a lot smarter than I am. And I just thought it was that. But there was other things with, for example, memory and kind of keeping things straight. I became very well known in school with the guy who wrote all over his hand and put sticky notes everywhere and would move things into the middle of the floor to remind me to do something in 5 or 10 minutes. But since I was succeeding in school and then later in my career, I or confidants that I talked to would brush it off. It's like, well, that's just the way people are. Don't worry about it. You're doing fine. And when I was in mission control, there was times that it would get really, really hard to focus and think things through. And I think part of it was my coping mechanisms as I was getting older were starting to not work quite as well. And I think also at that time, it's like, okay, well, it's time to move on to a different job anyway. I've been doing this for a while and I'm not feeling like I'm growing. So let's do something different. And then when I left mission control, because I guess I should also explain, when you're in mission control, you have to go through severe medical tests and stuff like that to make sure you're a really healthy person. And, if you're put on certain medications or certain diagnoses, you no longer can work in mission control, which I didn't want to risk that. So I also didn't want to ask too many questions in those phases. But when it was starting to get really hard, and I left the program or left mission control, I said, okay, maybe I should start exploring what this is. So I started talking to my doctor, and they then suggested that, it could be something that I should talk to a psychiatrist about. And I did do that. And at first she was a little bit incredulous, like, well, you're a PhD in astrophysics with, as a NASA flight director for many years. How could you have ADHD? But as we kind of started going through the questionnaire and discussion, she was like, oh yeah, that seems pretty clear to me now.
I think it's fascinating too, like having, like when you reflect in your career, and I speak for myself this way too, like you start to find underlying themes that are, there is my friend Tamsin Webster wrote a book called The Red Thread about this kind of thing, but like just following the through line with your career, like as a kid watching the moon landing, of course you're thinking you want to be an astronaut, but of course, many, as you mentioned, many people were thinking the same thing. But I'm always kind of jealous of people that are highly like successful, who are neurotypical, and who just like they see football, they love football, and I don't know why I said football. I don't understand football at all, but they choose the thing and they just stick with it their whole life, and then they get to where they want to be. And I find with ADHD, it has had me jump from thing to thing to thing most of my career. Do you find similarities there in that you sort of move from different things, but yet you had this underlying kind of thread?
Yeah, I thought a lot about that, trying to kind of think with that context. I think I've not jumped from career to career, but I have more on a micro scale, and I'll come back to that in a second. But I think what helped me was a drive that I don't think is typical. I don't think that's ADHD related. I think that just happens to be a little bit of a drive that if I want that, I will do what it takes to get there. So like in graduate school, for example, I sucked at math, and I would spend, the entire night or the entire weekend rewriting the textbook, trying to get it to sink in and better understand it. I worked, the old saying, work smarter, not harder. Well, I had to work harder, not smarter. But I think that drive kept me able to just, as I get knocked down, to just keep going. But in the job, when I was doing research or at NASA, it would be hard to stick at one thing. I craved constant change. I was an example. I was very good at skimming documents. This drives my wife a little crazy because we'll both read the same newspaper article, and I get kind of the gist and she gets the very details. And, I just always thought that's how people read things.
Right.
But in my job, if you say, Bob, go sit down and read this document from beginning to end, oh my God, that's torture for me, because my mind is just constantly racing. I'll read a paragraph and then, oh wait, I better go off and, do this or check this or look this up. And, it just takes me forever.
Mm. Yeah. And I'm similar that way too. So, and I also drive my wife a little crazy, but, I saw there was a TEDx Nashville presentation a number of years ago, and as a public speaker, a lot of my work is public speaking. And I'm curious if you saw this. It was Dr. Holly Bockelman, and it's called the Space-Time Symphony of Gravitational Waves. Does this ring any bells?
No, I'm afraid I'm not familiar with that talk.
Okay, I've got to send it to you because, I was so impressed by it that I wrote a blog post about it. She's an astrophysicist and was writing about really exploring the Milky Way and the work that she did, and and she has this gravitational wave dance that she did that she got the audience up, and it was just fascinating to learn about that. And I see that through line for you, obviously, in in exploring space. Do you see that as sort of that through line?
Yes, I definitely would say that. And I happen to be married to a person who studies behavior analysis.
Oh, wow.
She's a PhD in that. And so what I would probably phrase it from what I've learned from her is that beauty and wonder of exploring space, either unlocking the cosmos or helping an astronaut perform a spacewalk. That's the reinforcer for me. It just feels so beautiful. It gives me the passion or the drive to keep going.
And you could say that she studies the space between your ears.
Perhaps.
My wife's a school teacher, so she called me on ADHD many years ago and multiple times, and I'm like, yeah, whatever. Really, the moral of the story for me is listen to my spouse.
Yep, that's probably a good moral.
And as far as school goes, you had mentioned when we exchanged emails about some of the really just some of the abuse you dealt with from nuns. You mentioned milkshaking. Tell us about that and maybe how that might have driven you further.
Yes. Again, it's a little bit of a forehead slapper, when you get the diagnosis of ADHD and, the hyperactivity part of that, you kind of look back and it's like, oh, well, yeah, I was extremely hyper as a kid. My mom likes to tell the story about how I was climbing shelves before I was walking. And I used to, when I was in my crib, bang my head on the window until the window broke.
Oh my gosh.
I don't know. I guess I just had energy to burn. But in grade school, where I went to a Catholic school, whenever I got in trouble, which was very often, their solution was what they called a milkshake, which they would grab you by the neck and shake you up and down, very vigorously. As a little kid, they were robust, stout nuns. And besides the fact that that's probably the least effective to do in the situation, it in a way, it would kind of scatter the brain again a little bit. And, I probably had even more trouble trying to focus after that. It was just a weird thing, but that's, they didn't know how to deal with it, I guess. And it was usually some form of punishment or getting hit on the knuckles with rulers or things like that.
I did 7 years of Catholic school, and I share it in a presentation I do called The Root Down. But the short version here is I basically failed every year, but but my teacher would graduate me into the next grade just so she wouldn't have to deal with me again. So it was like just passing the buck, like just pass Dave on to the next. And it wasn't until my 7th grade when my teacher was like, oh, hang on a second. And he was awesome. And he was the type that was just like, okay, let's pause here for a minute, and held me back a year, which actually helped in the long term. But yeah, I can't imagine that kind of abuse in school like that, certainly.
And I guess we can sing the praise of teachers, because I probably too can point to a teacher that, kind of noticed something and, took the time to kind of help me and challenge me a bit. And I think that was part of it. I wasn't challenged in a way that, found that passion or anything that kind of, helped me to be more focused or participate more in school. And that teacher helped me a lot and really kind of changed the course. I went from a failing student. I mean, when I tell people I failed my 8th grade science project because I never did it, people look at me now and it's like, well, how could you do that? You're a scientist, and I love science, but I just sitting down to try and do a project. It's like, I didn't know how to do that. That was like torture.
And I think of a role as a flight director, obviously, actually maybe help to explain what's involved with that as a flight director. Because I imagine, you're not doing just one thing, right? It's more of you directing a whole bunch of different things at once. And I think for me, like with ADHD, when I do roles where I'm doing a lot of different things, almost all at once sometimes, and that's when I'm doing my best work a lot of the time. And when it's, as you said, when it's one thing, especially if it's something I'm not as interested in, then, that's tricky. So tell us a little bit about the role of a flight director and how that,
there's kind of 2 phases, what I'll call sort of office work, where you might be planning a mission. You might be preparing for a spacewalk, for example, coming up. And what that might entail is meeting with lots of different people, the people who are going to be overseeing the spacewalk, or the engineers that are going to be monitoring the equipment that's going to be used in the spacewalk. And so what it is you'll be just jumping from meeting to meeting, topic to topic, trying to absorb a lot of information. And as a director, you see where the issues or questions or problems or bottlenecks are, and, provide, a decision or direction, let's go this way. I want to do this, go make that happen. So it can be very quick and constantly changing. And then in the second phase, like in mission control, where you're executing it, the same sort of thing goes on. Now you've got to be talking to the communications person or the computer person, the people that are running the spacewalk, the talking to the astronaut next to you, who's your capsule communicator, talking to the astronauts in space. You're just constantly going, round robin, so to speak. And what you said a moment ago really, resonates with me, because on the days where, like, hey, you don't have any meetings today, you just need to kind of review that document, it would take me all day when it should take me an hour. But being able to jump between all those different tasks, constantly changing and bouncing around, like you said earlier, it's like, that's when I did my best work. I was able to, follow that challenge.
Yeah, I can't imagine. I mean, just the role of what you were doing too. I mean, I mean, as a complete novice, but I've looked up telescope. I mean, we just actually, my family and I, we just had a super moon, the blue moon, recently, and got the telescope out, and that was pretty cool. I actually posted a photo on my Instagram about it, were there moments when you were like driving home from the office, thinking like, oh my God, like I have one of the coolest jobs in the world, or just that your mind was blown? Tell me a little bit about your experiences doing such important and incredible work.
It was probably more frequent than you might think. I mean, there was definitely a lot of days I felt like lucky that people were paying me to do what I was doing. Because for one thing, it was constantly changing. It was never routine. There might be the day that I was talking to my Japanese colleague. Remember, it's International Space Station, so we've got people from around the world. And he just calmly says, "Hey, I've got to step outside. We just had an earthquake. Can you take over monitoring our systems?" That never happened before, and we weren't quite prepared for it, and we did it. There was another time where one of my flight controllers told me that there was some debris that was at a decent chance of hitting the space station, and we needed to do something about it. And, it was those constant things that were just, you go home and you like, well, I saved the astronauts today, or we accomplished this great science, experiment today on the space station, or this spacewalk that just was beautiful to watch. It was fairly frequently a very moving thing. And, outside at the main gate at NASA here in Houston, there's a Saturn V rocket. For most of my time here, it wasn't in a building. They recently put in a building, but a lot of times coming into work and leaving work, I'd look at that rocket and I'm like, man, I've got a cool job.
Well, to think that like you're communicating with people in space, and you have presumably multiple live feeds of said people in space. And I'm going to sound like a complete idiot with most of what I talk about here, because I am. But like I know enough to look up at the moon, let's say, or at a star, let's say, and realize like that star is from a long, long time ago. It must have been weird to like look up, and because every once in a while people can see the space station and like from the Earth, right? It kind of blows my mind. It's hard to communicate here.
No, I completely understand what you're trying to communicate, and I could even add some layers to it, because you can look up and see something like a dot of light going across the sky and go, yeah, that's a space station with 6 people or 5 people living there and doing stuff, and that's pretty cool. But then when you kind of go, when those modules, before we put them in space, I was inside of them. Those astronauts, I've had lunch with them. And tomorrow I'm going to go and, we're going to do a docking of a spacecraft to the space station together. And, it just, so yes, I would look up at it, and there was awe and wonder, but also an extreme sense of an accomplishment there.
Oh yeah. 100%. I remember doing my family and I, when the kids were little, we flew to Denver, rented a car, and we did 4 corners. And I remember being out like in the desert camping. We camped most of the way, and just looking up and like with no light pollution. And actually we really lucked out, because we went to the night that we went to the Grand Canyon, or the day we went to the Grand Canyon, they were having I think it was called a stargazing party or star party. And at this star party at night, and it's completely free, they kill all the natural light, or all the light, and they just have these red lights on across the park. And all these amateur astronomers show up with their, amateur telescopes that cost, probably in the tens of thousands. And they all set up shop and point their telescopes at different planets, and then you can walk around, climb a little. I remember my kids and myself climbing these little ladders or step ladders to look into them, or some had monitors set up so you could actually see what it was seeing. And my family and I still talk about it to this day. It was just incredible. I don't know if I had a question.
I can believe it. I mean, that was definitely the beauty and the passion. I was more interested in planets when I was a kid, so that's why I thought I'd end up, at JPL working on them. But seeing a planet from either the telescope or from some probe just always blew my mind away. It was amazing that we were able to do it, and it was not just the beauty of the planet, but always at the same time too. I'd be like, oh my God, we built that telescope. We built that spacecraft. How did those people do it?
Yeah. Did you see there's a Netflix documentary called Cosmic Time Machine about the James? Yeah, I just saw that not too long ago, just maybe a month ago. It's a documentary about the James Webb Space Telescope. What were your thoughts on that? And maybe for folks listening who are not familiar, can you maybe explain the James Webb Space Telescope?
Yeah, it was launched I think December of 21, I think it was about a year ago, a year and a half. I guess coming up on 2 years now. But it's a giant telescope in space. I can't remember the dimension of it, but it's much, much larger than the Hubble Space Telescope. And not only is it a large mirror collecting telescope that can see far back in time, but it also was technically a really challenging thing because something that large you couldn't just launch. You had to basically fold it up and then kind of like a extremely complicated umbrella, push a button and it all kind of unfurl and go into place, but not just be in place, but be in place to accuracies of, a thousandth of an inch or something for the optics to work right. So it just was technically incredibly challenging to put that together and make it work.
You find watching it, you're kind of holding your breath, hoping, and it's not just one thing that can go wrong or right. It's like step one is this, and it's a huge celebration, even though, I think it was one of 12 steps. So it was a huge win to get the first part to work, but then we've got to do the second and then the third. And I suppose a lot of your work was that, right? With as a flight director, you've got a lot of things that have to go right.
You are correct. And I spent a lot of nights laying in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to think what could go wrong. Because you try to anticipate the things. But one thing I've learned from the earliest days, it's probably a whole nother podcast, but I told you I'd started out working on the computers, and the station was designed. It had 3 identical computers that controlled every aspect of the station's operations. And you had 3 of them because if one crashed, like computers tend to do, you had 2 more. And if the second one crashed, you still had 1. And I was always trained, 3 was sufficient because there's no way in heck all 3 could ever fail. So about a month after we had put the system in space, I was home and a colleague called me and said, "Hey, one of the computers died." And I was in charge of these particular computers. And I said, "Okay, I'll be in the morning to help you kind of figure out what's going on. But, let me know if anything's, you've got the other 2. And I go in the next morning and we're kind of looking at things and the second one died. And we said, well, that's not good, but we still got the third one. And then it died.
Oh,
and that's that 48-hour period as we came extremely close to losing the early International Space Station. The only thing that prevented us from losing it is the space shuttle happened to be docked at the time, and we could use the communication link that the space shuttle offered. But one of the things I realized, if you haven't seen the movie Apollo 13, you really have to. We actually used to use that. We still do. They use it for training because it's so accurate. But it wasn't the technology. In fact, those computers that we were trying to figure out how to recover, were ancient by even those standards in 2001, let alone today. I mean, they were 386 chips, and most people don't even know what that is, but you couldn't find a calculator that stupid nowadays, a cell phone that stupid nowadays. But the passion of the people, that's really what had that work. So you're right, 100 things had to go right for that space shuttle to undock and those astronauts that were on it to safely come home. And for the astronauts on the space station to safely stay there, we had to recover those computers, and we only had a few days to do it. But everyone kind of working around the clock. And this was one of the things that I think probably helped me become a flight director, because I was leading a lot of those tasks, and we were doing it well, and we recovered it. And it was one of those moments where you like we were talking earlier, that when you're driving home, you're like, you can't believe what you just accomplished. You know, it's amazing and rewarding beyond belief.
Oh yeah, I can't imagine. And also, as a bit of a nerd myself, I am picturing a 386 in 2001, and I'm like, wait, weren't we better yet? Like, I guess the iPhone was what, 2007, I guess.
Well, the problem is
we still had a ways to go.
Yeah, when you design something and launch it into space, by the time you design it, test it, launch it, it's already, years later. And, you can't just take the latest iPhone with you. Wait, we were using this one back then. That's what you got to go with.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. Yeah. Yeah. And also, like, if it works, like, that's the important thing, right? Like, if it's doing what you need it to do, I mean, that's the most important thing. So
now going back to the thread a little bit, when I came and I was in charge of those computers, I mentioned earlier that because I had written some software, they said, hey, you can be in charge of the computers. So trying to understand how they worked. I was not a computer scientist, but I would literally spend hours every night going through the code line by line and going, well, what would that do? How would that work? And I wasn't good at reading the user manual. I went through the code because that was the only way I could kind of figure out how to do it. And the brain, it was very challenging for me, but that's kind of how I was able to kind of just persevere, if that makes any sense.
It does make sense. I've always, and I know two ADHDers, or wise squirrels, as I like to call us. We're not all the same. Of course, we all have, different things, but we all have similar operating systems, as I like to say. And I always like problem solving. Like, I like challenges where I'm using my own, creativity to come, to find solutions to things. And I think, even early days I've never claimed to be a developer, but, I knew enough code to, build and break my website. So I knew enough HTML and JavaScript and things like that. And even BASIC back in the day in DOS. But, as a kid, I would use like PC Magazine and transcribe the code into my Commodore 64 or my TRS-80 to try to like create code. And one little error, and there was just no way to know where it was. And it was, you'd pull your hair out of your head trying to find that one little mistake. And nowadays it's interesting and I'm curious, have you poked around with AI, with ChatGPT and things, where like you can ask ChatGPT, give me the code for this, and it just spits it out? It's wild.
Yes, I've not played around with the code like that, but I work for the company Blue Origin now. I left NASA last year. I retired from NASA and kind of worked with Blue Origin. You may be familiar with them. They do the New Shepard suborbital flights in West Texas. William Shatner went up a couple years ago as one of the folks, we're planning. We got a contract with NASA to do a lunar lander for taking the crew back to the moon, and things like that we're working on, that we want to have to be fairly autonomous. And one of the challenges that for a while I was on a group kind of thinking about it was, okay, normally, kind of like what you were talking about, is you write the code, and then you test the code, where you say, okay, well, the code is supposed to, if A happens, do B. So you make A happen and you make sure B happens as a result. Well, now that you're using AI to do some of this stuff, the question is, how do you verify it? Because if you're going to put humans' lives at risk on that space vehicle that's being operated by code that came from AI, how do you, if you say, oh, well, if A happens, did B happen, is not a straightforward thing if AI kind of coded it up and stuff. So there's definitely some interesting challenges there.
Yeah, I think of AI sort of like guns. Not that I'm into guns, but or other tools, let's say, that could be used. Well, I mean, you could even say the internet, like it could be used for great things, but then also maybe not so great things. And yeah, obviously we're very early days with AI, but I could also picture 2001, speaking of movies, what are you doing, Bob?
Yeah.
There's some concern about that kind of aspect to it too. Have you guys been talking about that? Obviously, I would imagine those kinds of scenarios have popped up in your minds.
We've talked about it, but again, kind of in a fortuitous, I guess you could, well, maybe fortuitous isn't the right word, but we've talked about it, but I then got on a different project. So yeah, it was kind of a limited thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And you can't, I mean, that's the thing with innovation. It doesn't matter. I mean, we saw what happened with like the music industry and the publishing industry when they didn't, adopt the internet quickly enough and social media quickly enough, and kind of fell behind. So there's this line in, sort of startup world of innovate or die. Like you've got to innovate. I mean, we always need to improve things, and it's just a matter of keeping track of stuff. What are you most excited about as it applies to, space exploration and the future?
I think the thing that I'm most excited about right now is what I kind of as a kid thought would be where we would be, in 1990 or something, 1980. In the sense that, it's not NASA doing a big, expensive trip to the moon. You've got all these companies, and not just in America, but, you've got a lot of different companies. When I was a student, and people talked about things like what SpaceX is doing today, that's the Elon Musk company that takes astronauts to the space station and does some other stuff. That a company could go and make a profit off of it. In fact, we always used to joke that if you want to make a small fortune in the space business, you start off with a large fortune. But now you've got companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin and Sierra Space and Axiom and a host of others that are just finding awesome and unique ways to explore space, expand our presence in space, bring the cost down and make it profitable. The fact that we've got multiple companies that are building lunar landers and looking at space stations, and multiple people that can launch rockets and payloads, for the military or civilians or whatever, is just an amazing time in history, I think.
Is there ever concern with, I'm sort of obsessed with communication and communication skills, but like with perhaps a lack of communication across multiple companies doing this, where, accidents can happen, where, you look at the International Space Station, and of course I'm no expert. You're the expert on this stuff, but with the International Space Station, when you talked about your Japanese colleague who had to step away, I think of like the International Space Station that way as such an interesting it's almost like the United Nations in a way, right? Like a mix of people from different countries, and really all of that doesn't matter because you're all there on the same mission together. And that's something to be celebrated in a big way, where with multiple countries and multiple, racing to space with different operations, is there worry that communication can falter somehow because of this, or because of maybe the race to innovation?
Yes, there's definitely challenges there. NASA, for example, on the International Space Station, I think has had such success because I think what you're touching on is there's been parts, for example, that were built in different countries that never saw each other until they were put together in space, and it worked. But the thing is, it took a lot of testing and documentation and people checking and double checking and triple checking. So you can do that, but it's extremely slow and expensive. So as you kind of said a moment ago, as these companies are trying to innovate, now granted, a lot of them are kind of doing it all themselves, but a lot of times, like for example, if you're going to launch an Air Force payload off of your rocket, you've got to make sure you're checking things carefully. And now when you're trying to make sure you're making a profit, but you want to do it safely, there's always challenges and trades and discussions you have to have. And you just have to hope that you're really focusing on the critical parts of it.
Yeah, because it really is a collaboration. I mean, there's so much at stake, and even with like Elon Musk and Starlink, like as and the sort of potential for problems, delivering or not delivering the communication needs. I know Ukraine has been very reliant upon Starlink for internet access and to be able to communicate with one another, as for defense. If that goes away, or Elon pulls the plug, so to speak, because he just decides to shift over more to Tesla or Twitter or whatever it's called now. Yeah, I don't know. It's a very interesting time with all this, but it is really exciting to see how this is kind of unfolding. It's exciting.
Yeah, I've been excited that I have been and that I continue to be a part of it. So it's just been fascinating. It's exceeded my dreams, and it's kind of interesting. I told you at the beginning I wanted to be an astronaut, and then I kind of had to change paths a little bit. And then for a long time, I envisioned, like I mentioned, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, the control rooms, you see that where they do like the Mars rovers that are walking around. And I thought, okay, that's going to be me. And then one day I'm standing in NASA's mission control in Houston, talking to astronauts in the International Space Station. And I'm like, wow, I'm doing exactly what I wanted to do, but it's totally different. And it was just awesome.
Yeah, and that's such a cool revelation to have, right? I remember I was at a tech conference in Seattle years ago and saw Scott Maxwell was speaking there, and he was one of the operators of the Mars Explorer, I think, of the rover. And it was just like this. I remember he put on the screen a picture. It was like the first time, or I'm sure it wasn't the first time, but for us anyway, it was the first time we saw a picture of, I believe it was the Earth from Mars. And it was just like our minds were just blown. And then he was like showing videos and explaining kind of how he controlled this thing. And it's so wild. And it's also so important, I think, for people to realize like just how not insignificant we are, and not to get woo woo, but maybe a little woo when it comes to, considering the universe about what's out there.
No, I definitely would agree with that. There was many nights when I was in graduate school. That was in Toledo, Ohio, and we actually had a 1 meter telescope there. And basically every night that it was clear, I would be up there observing, which really makes it tough on your love life, because try asking someone out and saying, okay, I'd like to go on a date with you, but only if it's cloudy. But I survived. But there was many a night where I'd be sitting up there and I'd be looking out at the heavens. And I know this may sound like a cliche, but you're looking out there and you're thinking about how big the universe is, how many stars are out there. And, you just logically can't come to any other conclusion other than out there are other creatures looking back at me. And looking at the vastness of space and trying to understand it all. And it's mind-boggling and beautiful at the same time.
It truly is. It's fascinating to me. It really is. It's pretty wild. As far as the ADHD goes, and I know in a late diagnosis that it's especially important not to dwell too much, I think, on the past in any sort of negative way. And sometimes that can happen. But what are your feelings about that actually? Like not necessarily dwelling, but certainly considering the past, like had you been diagnosed with ADHD as a kid and treated, or, the treatments were as great as they are now when you were a kid, like, do you ever think about that?
Yes. There was kind of two phases. One, especially in the doctor's office the first time, but definitely multiple times after that, where I cried. I just kind of sat around and cried because it was validation. I always struggled. I always knew in a sense that, I was different, but had no way to put words to it. And that's one thing that the coaching has really kind of helped me kind of put words to it a little bit. And so that validation was just, to me, very moving. And then, yes, I've in the second phase, I've since then I've looked back a lot, and it's like, man, knowing how I feel now on the treatments, what I wish I could have done back then. And, I don't want to say like, oh, my life would have been better. I can't say that. I'm pretty pleased with the way things came out. But, when you think back, and maybe you've done this too, and, you think about when you were really, really struggling and feeling really low perhaps about it. And it's like, man, I probably could have avoided a lot of that. Maybe not, maybe other issues would have been there, but, it's hard not to think back after, when you hit 60 and look back at many, many years without really knowing what was going on or treating it, what might have been.
Yeah. And I think it's important to, for me personally, certainly there are regrets and things like that. However, I also think, you could walk out the door today and go left or right or straight, let's say, or back in because you forgot your keys, and then an anvil could fall from the sky, or maybe that's a bad. But my point is, it's like I wouldn't be here today. I have a nice house. I have an incredible wife. I married my best friend. I'm very lucky that way. I've got a very cute dog, and I apologize for her being yappy there a little while ago. I've got two incredible kids. Like, my life's not perfect, but I've got a really great life. And maybe had I been treated earlier on, I might have gone left instead of right. And I could have ended up worse or in a negative, bad place. So like I think celebrating your wins are really important. And, gosh, yeah, I think we all beat ourselves up a little bit too much. And you've had like just such an incredible career. I mean, and kudos to Mr. Bezos and his team for hiring you, because I think having somebody with your experience and knowledge is especially important.
Well, I definitely enjoy it because, again, I guess I get to use my superpower fairly often, because I might be working on a lunar module discussion one day, or a scientific payload the next day, or a space station the next day. And that definitely keeps me interested and able to go on. And it's very interesting and enjoyable.
And as far as Chris goes and coaching, share a little bit about your experience in in working with an ADHD coach, and because I want other people to do the same. I'm doing the same as well, and I have found it to be very helpful.
Sure. It was kind of interesting because it was not long after I'd been diagnosed and, sitting around a lot going, okay, now what? What does this mean? What do I do? If anything? And my wife knew Chris from the coach that I ended up going with, from a book club, and mentioned that she was an ADHD coach. And I'm like, what the heck is that? Is that someone that sits by the sidelines and say, you can do it, stay focused. So I really had no idea what it was going to be. And I reached out to her, and she was just, wonderful. And it was more of a pick my own adventure. I didn't know what I wanted to get out of it. And I'll be honest, at first, I'm kind of like, am I wasting money? Because I'm going to go and I'm going to talk to this person. And I'm going to, maybe it's good for 50 minutes, but, I had no idea really what was going to come out of it. And she, steered me in a way. Mainly, a lot of it was self-examination. A lot of it was helping me to kind of put explanation or vocabulary behind things. She and some of it was kind of like eureka moments, I guess. I mean, maybe not for her, but more for me, where I'm describing something and she goes, well, have you might want to get like a fidget toy. And the light bulb went off, and I'm like, why do I need to get one? My desk is covered with them. It's a pen, it's a nail clipper, it's a binder clip. Suddenly I realized that like the entire day I'm fiddling with these things. And she pointed out how, and I don't know if this was science or theory or conjecture on her part, but she was like, well, that can kind of use up the energy or occupy, I guess, that part of my brain or body that had that nervous energy and allow me to focus better. And I realized that's exactly what I've been doing with these little gadgets on my desk. The next day I'm in a meeting and I'm like, oh, that person's saying something really important. And I realized I was reaching for my pen to play with. And I'm like, oh, yeah. So I have been doing that. I just never really thought of it that way. So there's a lot of things like that we kind of talk through that allowed me to make sense of what I experienced otherwise with ADHD, but didn't know it was that, or why I was doing it, or how maybe I could better deal with it in certain ways. So it was amazingly eye-opening for me.
Yeah, and I suppose getting back to the International Space Station, right? Like understanding all these different components to ultimately make it all work. I think there's definitely similarities in that the better you know yourself and your operating system, I think the better your life can be as well.
I totally agree with that. And not from a point of regret, but kind of the self-reflection we were talking about earlier. I've thought about what if I went back to this or that event, this mission, that time in school or something, knowing what I know now. And I don't mean just the fact that I'm 60 and I've had a lot of life, but to put into words of for example, I've been able to have, after some of those coaching sessions, discussions with my wife, and I'm like, hey, I now better understand when we have this interaction, why, for example, I get impatient and get upset. And that allowed me to kind of, first of all, explain it to her. So she was like, okay, well, now I'm more aware of what you're thinking and going through. And then also for me to just be that aware and go, oh, wait, I'm doing that thing. Let me back out of that and, have a better interaction. And that's definitely happened and been helpful.
Yeah, just knowing yourself and then improving the way you're communicating is huge. And yeah, I've it sounds very familiar. Well, I want to be respectful of your time. I know we've already gone over a little bit. Was there any topics, any questions that I left off, or anything you'd like to share?
I don't think so. I mean, it's been an interesting journey. I mean, I was lucky. I look back and I can probably think of 90 times where I could have gone left instead of right, even though right was where I kind of wanted to go. And I was lucky that I don't know why I had that drive, that passion, that kept saying, no, I know it's hard, or you maybe don't understand it, but you want to get over that way. So go right. And now kind of knowing, the giant light bulb in my life has gone off over my head. I'm like, oh, it didn't have to be that hard. It's not as hard now as it used to be. Between the treatment and the coaching, it's just been, maybe wonderful journey is too strong of a word, but it's been an interesting challenge and an interesting journey. And I'm glad, at least in the last year or so, I've been able to do that part of the journey.
Well, thank you so much for sharing all of this with us today. It's been really an amazing conversation with you.
My pleasure.
Hey, thanks for listening to Wise Squirrels. It has been amazing to share this with you. Best way to show your support for the show: leave us a review, follow the show, and share it with the people in your life. We drop new episodes every 2 weeks, so stay tuned for that. Plus, drop by wisesquirrels.com or click the link in the podcast description, and you'll find a lot of different resources like articles, an assessment, a newsletter, lots of good stuff over at wisesquirrels.com. So drop by, let me know what you think, and we'll see you next time. Take care. Wise Squirrels is brought to you by The Root Down, an ADHD-inspired presentation and process to know, respect, and connect yourself. Available now for conferences and savvy companies. The Root Down will bring your team together, teach them about neurodiversity, and a lot more. Check out The Root Down, read the reviews over at wisesquirrels.com today.